For this summer, we found plane tickets to the US that were 900 euros cheaper than what we were planning on paying for flights in and out of Paris. But there was a catch. We'd have to fly in and out of Zurich Airport instead of Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport, colloquially known as CDG. By the time we factored in getting to notoriously expensive Switzerland, unexpected baggage fees, and all the hidden costs, did we actually save any money? You're about to find out. Hi everyone, I'm Suzi, I'm American, and I've been living here in beautiful Dijon, France since 2008. Today, I'm going to break down the real costs and time involved in getting to the Zurich airport versus CDG, including train options and driving costs. But before we get started, I just wanted to remind you to sign up for my email newsletter by scanning this QR code or by clicking on the link in the video description below to get more practical information about life in France delivered directly to your email inbox. One of the inconveniences of living here in Dijon is just how difficult it is to get to a big international airport from here. It always involves multimodal transportation. We don't fly to the States that often ourselves, usually about once every other year. And when we have flown as a family, we've always flown in and out of CDG. We used to have a direct train from Dijon to CDG, which was way better than any of the other options that we have now. And I'll talk more about that later. The options that we have now are either driving to Paris and trying to find a place that's relatively affordable to park, or taking the train from Dijon to the Gare de Lyon. When you take the train, you arrive in downtown Paris and you have to find a way to get to the airport. So there are a couple options. There's the RER, which is like the commuter rail, but then you have to change lines and that's kind of a hassle. There are buses, but we, over the past, in the past few years, we've realized that it's just cost efficient for us just to take a taxi as a family of four. So when we arrive at the Gare de Lyon, we just take a taxi to CDG from there. For context, there were 3 of us traveling on this trip: my husband, my 10-year-old, and me. My other son had flown to the US much earlier in the summer on his own. He flew out of CDG to the US on Play, a low-cost airline with a layover in Iceland. It was a flight that we had booked back in March, and I drove him to CDG by myself. I did the round trip from Dijon to CDG back to Dijon in one day. It was long and expensive and unpleasant, and more about that a little bit later as well. In March, we had also bought tickets for the 3 of us. Same thing on Play out of CDG with a layover in Iceland. We were planning on leaving for the States about a month after my older son, and we paid 770 euros and 79 cents per person. So 2,312 euros and 37 cents for the 3 of us. But then in April, our tickets were canceled by the airline. We were a bit frantic when our flights were canceled, but in the meantime, we had also heard that airfare had dropped. So we kind of thought that it might be a blessing in disguise and that we might be able to find replacement tickets cheaper. So my husband started looking and he managed to find tickets out of Zurich for 472 euros a person for a total of 1,417 euros and 23 cents, saving us 895 euros and 14 cents, almost 900 euros. But now we needed to get to Zurich. For some reason, we thought that we each had one checked luggage included in the price of our tickets as well. But in fact, that was not the case. And we only figured it out once we arrived at the Zurich airport. So we wound up paying to check one bag for our flight to the States, and then we wound up having to pay to check 2 bags for the flight back to Europe. I do think that the price of our original tickets on Play included one checked bag for each of us, and so paying for the additional baggage is something that we need to take into account as well when we're doing these calculations. So we now had to get to Zurich, and we knew that we had the same 2 options that we have when we're trying to get to CDG. That is, we knew that we could either drive and park there or take the train. Let's start by considering the train. The fast TGV Lyria runs directly from Dijon to Zurich's central train station. The trip takes about 2 hours and 25 minutes. And once you arrive at the Zurich central train station, you take a train to the Zurich airport, which takes about 10 minutes, apparently. So let's break down how much it would have cost if we had chosen to take the train. So I found 3 train tickets from Dijon to Zurich for 202 euros and 50 cents, and 3 return tickets from Zurich to Dijon for 237 euros and 60 cents for a total of 440 euros and 10 cents. These were, like I said, 3 tickets for 2 adults and 1 10-year-old child in second class, direct trains with no discount codes or discount cards or of any kind. And these were for random dates in September because I can't go back in time and see how much we would have paid in August. But I remember when we were doing our initial research, it was around the same amount. And then, like I said, you arrive at the Zurich train station, but you need to get to the airport. And so those train tickets cost, I saw online, they're 3.5 Swiss francs per adult. And I estimated that my son would have paid 3 Swiss francs, so round trip again. And that total is about 20 Swiss francs or 21 euros and 41 cents. And then, of course, we need to get to the Dijon train station as well. So we need round trip tickets on our tram. So that's six tickets on our tram for €1.40 each. So that's €8.40. So the total cost for the train travel from our door to the Zurich airport would have been €469.91. And the total travel time would have been about 3 hours. Of course, these trains are just an absolute pleasure. You can work or relax. There's no stress involved in driving. You can look out the window and admire the countryside. And it's usually a very pleasant experience on these trains. And of course, another huge advantage is that after having just flown from the States back to Europe, we're just exhausted. And so it's so much more comfortable just to be able to get on the train and relax and for no one to have to drive in those conditions. And we know that train. We've taken it before. My husband and I took that direct train to Zurich a couple of years ago and spent a weekend exploring Zurich, which is an amazing city. And of course, it's so easy and fast on the trains. I was hoping that this would be the most cost-effective solution, but considering that in this case we had to buy 3 round-trip train tickets, in the end, we did the calculations, and unfortunately, that just wasn't the case. So now let's talk about what we actually did, which was to drive there. The distance from Dijon to where we parked in Zurich is 339 kilometers, which translates to 3 hours and 38 minutes of driving each way under normal driving conditions, according to Via Michelin. That's compared to about 335 kilometers from Dijon to CDG, which basically takes just as long depending on the time of day and on Paris traffic. So sometimes it can take a bit longer. If we hadn't been looking for it, we probably wouldn't have even noticed when we crossed the Swiss border, and the roads in Switzerland are well maintained and easy to navigate. Using Via Michelin to calculate the distance and the trip cost, this is a cool feature of this website, driving to where we parked at the Novotel by the airport cost about €91.08, including the Swiss vignette, which is included in the cost for the way there. For the return trip, we could deduct the vignette cost, which was 44 euros or 40 Swiss francs, bringing our total driving cost to 138 euros and 16 cents for gas and tolls. So what is this Swiss vignette that cost us 40 Swiss francs? It's a highway toll sticker. Well, now it's a virtual sticker that's required for driving on Swiss motorways. We basically paid for the right to drive on Swiss highways for 14 months. The dates of the validity were from December 1st, 2024 to January 31st, 2026. So now it's all done online at the official website, which is www.e-vignette.ch, and I'll put the address up here and a screenshot of the website as well. Just be careful for imposter websites and even websites that still sell the vignette but that charge you more. It should cost 40 Swiss, which is equivalent to about 44 euros. And for the parking, we didn't park at the airport. Like I mentioned earlier, we parked at the Novotel by the airport. We used One Park, which is a company with a website and an app. We parked from August 6th to August 28th, and we paid 159 euros and 10 cents. One Park is a service that lets you reserve discounted parking spots in hotel garages through their website or app, and it sends you an access code to enter the garages at cheaper rates than standard airport or city parking. We did have some technical issues with this. In fact, the code that they sent us didn't work either when we arrived at the Novotel parking garage or when we tried to leave the Novotel parking garage. So we just called the customer service number and they responded very quickly. But in the end, it was actually the hotel staff who helped us. But everyone was very helpful and we didn't wind up paying anything extra, and it only took a few minutes to resolve the problem. And another little expense we had was tram tickets. So we actually bought 4 tram tickets for 3 people because, in fact, my husband dropped us off. My son and I, he dropped us off at the airport because we didn't know if it was going to be tricky to navigate the tram with our luggage. So he dropped us off at the airport, went back, parked at the Novotel, and then took the tram from the Novotel to the Zurich airport. Realized it was so easy to do that the 3 of us took the tram on the way home. We took the tram from the Zurich airport back to the Novotel. It was really simple. When we were leaving the Zurich airport, we just followed the signs for the tram, and then we paid at this distributor using our Wise Cards contactless Apple Pay to avoid any foreign currency fees, since it's, of course, the Swiss franc in Switzerland. And then we took the line 12 from the airport, 5 stops to the Novotel, which was located at Lindberghplatz. The Zurich tram was fast and smooth. I loved this part. As many of you know, I am a big fan of trams. This one was great. And I was just surprised that we couldn't pay in the tram. 4 tram tickets total cost us 10 Swiss francs and 80 cents. I don't know how you say prices in Swiss francs, which is equivalent to 11 euros and 56 cents. To summarize, the total costs that we incurred by driving were gas and tolls, 138 euros and 16 cents, parking, 159 euros and 10 cents, the tram in Zurich, 11 euros and 56 cents, for a total of 308 euros and 82 cents. So if we go back and compare to how much we would have paid for the 3 of us to take the train, that amount, again, was 469 euros and 91 cents. Obviously, if there had just been 2 of us, or if I had been traveling alone, then it would have made more sense to take the train. But with 3 people, in the end, it wound up being cheaper, but I found it to be still quite expensive to drive and park by the Zurich airport. The drive from Dijon to Zurich is actually quite pleasant and much less stressful than the drive from Dijon to CDG. Even if the ride is relatively nice and easy, it's still really hard to drive after having flown from the States back to Europe. My husband managed to do it. I think he slept more than I did on the plane. I could hardly stay awake as the passenger, and I felt really bad because I wanted to be able to support him in his driving. He said he was fine. We did stop for coffee at one point, but I think that it inevitably it's really a challenge for the person who has to drive after having flown overnight. One last thing to remember is that in Switzerland, like in France, there are lots of speed traps, so it's just really important to be careful and try to respect the speed limit so that you don't accidentally get a speeding ticket. Now to talk a little bit more about the Zurich airport experience. My first impression of the Zurich airport in early August was just how calm it was. This was the scene when we went to drop off our luggage and check in for the flight. There was hardly anyone else even waiting in line. Granted, we arrived quite early, but the departure board showed many European destinations, plus our flight to Boston, one to Newark, and one to Bangkok, for example. Apparently, about 725 flights arrive and depart out of Zurich per day. There is a little shuttle called the Sky Metro that takes you around the Zurich airport, and it's complete with a little zoetrope-like film that flashes on the wall of the tunnel, which I tried to catch here. The gate areas were really quite pleasant with these beautiful views of the surrounding countryside. We had gotten to the gate quite early, and of course it did fill up more as our flight got closer, but it was still just a pleasant experience overall. Granted, when we got back at the end of August, my son and I had to wait for quite a while in an immigration line to get our passports checked. Whereas my husband offered to wait with us, but I told him to just go ahead and get the luggage. He was able to just go through those automatic passport control gates because he has a French passport. I am also French, but for some reason I just haven't bothered to get a French passport, so I travel with my American passport. And if I had had a French passport, I would have been able to go through one of those gates as well. So as we were waiting in line, I was thinking to myself, maybe it's time to get my French passport. In any case, we would have had to wait for my son because, as the immigration officer explained to me, they need to do a visual check on kids who are under 12. So if he had been older and if I had had a French passport, we would have also been able to go right through the automatic passport control gates, and we wouldn't have had to wait in line. But really, it was okay. I would say we probably waited for 15 to 20 minutes. Now let's talk about what we usually do, which is flying in and out of CDG, which is roughly the same distance from Dijon as Zurich, but the experience of flying out of CDG feels very different. So first, there is the driving option, which is in fact what we did in 2023 when we went to the US and flew out of CDG. We drove to Paris and we parked at a friend's. So we saved on parking, but we still, of course, had to pay for gas and tolls and then a taxi from our friends to the airport. Via Michelin says that the trip costs 44 euros and 35 cents each way for the gas and tolls, and takes 3 hours and 38 minutes, which, funnily enough, is exactly the same amount of time that it said it took to get from Dijon to where we parked in Zurich. So that's about 90 euros round trip for gas and tolls. And we were lucky and didn't have to pay for parking. But of course, many people would have to pay for parking. And then we paid for a taxi from our friends to the airport, which I think it was about 60 euros. So all told, we paid about 150 euros to drive and park from Dijon to CDG back in 2023. And then there's the train option, which we've done several times as well. So, of course, we have the direct TGV from Dijon to Paris, Gare de Lyon. It takes an hour and 40 minutes on the fast train. And just to try to get an idea for how much those tickets cost, I looked online and I found second-class TGV tickets for 2 adults and one 10-year-old with no discounts on just random dates in about a month from now. And I found 3 tickets from Dijon to Gare de Lyon for 75 euros. But the return ticket prices, when I was just shopping just to get an idea of how much the prices were all over the place. They were a mix of slow trains and fast trains with one super good deal. So let's assume I just get lucky at one point and I get a good deal. This was crazy. A cheap TGV, we'd have to assume that it would work in terms of timing, but it was only 37 euros and 50 cents for 3 tickets. So let's say 112 euros and 50 cents total for the trains. But that's assuming we just get really lucky and get a great deal. And of course, then we've only arrived at the Gare de Lyon. Now we still need to get to the airport. So we're going to take a taxi, and the taxi is about 60 euros. And don't forget the tram in Dijon. Again, we have taken the tram from our stop here near our house to the train station, and then we have to do that trip back. So that's 6 tram tickets for €1.40 each. That's another €8.40. So the total for the train and the taxi and the tram is 180 euros and 90 cents. So again, in this scenario, driving is cheaper than taking the train, which is exactly why we did it in 2023. Now, in terms of the time it will take you, if you do take the train, to get from Dijon to Paris, Gare de Lyon, and then on to Charles de Gaulle, CDG, the airport. In the absolute best case scenario, Google is telling me that it takes 2.5 hours to get from Dijon to CDG via TGV and RER, but everything would have to be operating perfectly for that to happen. But okay, why not? Let's just say it takes about 3 hours in that case. So I wanted to mention again our old friend, the direct train from Dijon to CDG. It was fantastic, but it was discontinued. Everyone in Dijon laments the disappearance of this train, and there was even a petition circulating online trying to convince whomever the decision makers are to bring it back. And oh my gosh, this is so sad. I just looked it up. The petition was going around in 2022. Still today in 2025, nothing. And like I said, we don't necessarily even fly to the US that often. This is not really much of a problem for us personally, but we do have friends and family that come and visit us occasionally. And so it just makes it so much more of a challenge for them to get from CDG, which is where they usually land, to us here in Dijon. And it would be just so much easier if they could reinstate this train. I was looking online, though, and I did see that there's a chance they're going to start operating this train line again in 2027, which would be amazing. Granted, like I mentioned earlier, if you haven't yet had the chance to experience CDG, it's a very different experience than the Zurich airport. It's massive, often chaotic, and can be overwhelming. Apparently, around 2,000 flights depart and arrive daily at CDG, so that's almost 3 times more than Zurich. You're dealing with big crowds, especially in summer, spread out terminals, and what I find to be just a generally more stressful atmosphere. Although I do have to say that, like I said, I drove my son to CDG earlier in the summer, and he was flying in and out of Terminal 3, which was a much more pleasant experience, maybe because it's just a much smaller scale. But at the beginning of the summer, we did have a relatively reasonable, almost pleasant experience at CDG. So maybe it's not all bad. So to compare the two airports based on my most recent experience with them, Zurich Airport was a very pleasant environment, whereas we did have to wait in one long line at one point, which is a little annoying, versus CDG, which is usually a much more stressful environment. However, this summer we got lucky and had a relatively pleasant experience there. So one thing to note, flying from Zurich to Boston means traveling east first and then further west once you're in the air, which is a bit of a detour. So once we were in the air, actually, we could see that we were flying not too far from Dijon. So flying from Zurich adds about 30 minutes to the length of the flight compared to flights which are just a bit shorter when you leave from CDG. All right, so that was a lot of numbers and a lot of information. So we're going to try to sort of boil it down into a table so that we can compare the two scenarios. So was it all worth it in the end? Did we actually save any money? In the column here, we can see that our original tickets from Paris were going to cost 2,312 euros. Their transport cost would have been about 150 euros. And I think that our luggage was included in our tickets. So the total cost of the trip would be 2,463 euros. That didn't happen this year. So those flights were canceled. We had to find a plan B, and we wound up finding these relatively cheap tickets out of Zurich. For 3 people, we paid 1,417 euros for our tickets, which was a big difference of almost 900 euros. However, the transportation cost from Dijon to Zurich was almost twice what we would have paid if we had traveled instead to Paris. So 308 euros and 82 cents. And then we had these additional baggage fees for 200 euros. But in the end, the total was still only just 1,926 euros, which in the end was a big savings of over 500 euros, 536 euros and 32 cents to be precise. So it was definitely worth it in the end. The 900 euros that we saved on the flights were partially absorbed by the extra transportation costs and the unexpected baggage fees. But the whole experience of flying in and out of Zurich was much more pleasant, in my opinion. And it was really fun to do these calculations because my general sentiment, my feeling was that it had been cheaper overall, but I wasn't really sure until I actually did these calculations. So this is just one example of one trip, but it gives you an idea of some of the costs that are associated with this type of travel from Europe to the US. And I hope maybe this was helpful if you are someone who may be, for example, planning your own upcoming trip. One last reminder to go ahead and sign up for my email newsletter by scanning this code or by clicking on the link in the video description below if you haven't yet and you would like to receive more practical content like this delivered directly to your email inbox. Another great thing that you could do is subscribe to my channel. In any case, thank you so much for watching as well, and until the next time, à bientôt!